Today, I want to talk to you about masters and slaves. I talked last week about our relationship to material possessions when I preached on the subject of the rich fool. So I won't revisit that subject today, other than to say that Jesus was a prophet of the nearness of the kingdom of God. And he had actually himself, as well as his followers, had left houses, family, and lands, and he has set his face toward Jerusalem, where in Luke's gospel he anticipates his own death. So Jesus' attitude toward material wealth was modeled and taught as being very loose, to hold wealth, material things very loosely, because in a moment they might be gone. Not only through our own death, but also his anticipation that the kingdom of God was near to arrive, and the entire political and economic regime that he was experiencing at the time was about to pass off the scene. So the way to prepare for the coming kingdom was to put your treasure there. And how to put your treasure there is to sell your possessions, give alms to the poor, and trust that God will take care of you in the intervening time while you await the kingdom. But he uses a parable in this lesson, and he uses a theme that is kind of shocking to modern ears. He draws from the surrounding culture and gives us a parable based on the practice of slavery. He's done this before. If you follow the teachings of Jesus, you'll know that he often drew his parables from everyday circumstances that were part of his world. And slavery was so ubiquitous in that world, in the Roman Empire. Estimates are that somewhere in the area of about 10 to 15% of the total population of the empire that Rome dominated were slaves. In the city itself of Rome, we're somewhere in the area of 25 to 40% at any given time in the city of Rome itself were slaves. So slavery was, in that time period, as well as in virtually every time period up until relative years, was a practice that was quite common. So Jesus drew from that surrounding culture, and he used a lot of parables, or at least some parables, based on slavery. Two different ones right here in this same context. So I want to talk to you about the Bible and slavery today, because it's an important question. For those of us who've grown up around the Bible, we may not have thought that deeply about it, but there are other people who hear these texts and they find it to be quite jarring. And they have been very, in a bad way, instrumental in our own American history. I grew up in the South, and the history of the South prior to the Civil War, and even after it, was heavily influenced by, well, at least by not only their economic interests, but the way they used the Bible to cover for the practice of owning other human beings as labor-saving devices. And so I want to explore this a little bit with you today and try to explain how we can read the Bible and what do we do with texts like this when we confront them. You know, slavery is still an issue in our world today. We often highlight, and here highlighted, the role of human trafficking, and that still goes on. There are still regions of the world where slavery has been almost continuously practiced since the agricultural revolution. Mauritania, people might be surprised to know, it wasn't until the year 2007 that Mauritania officially, first of all, you may not know where Mauritania is, off the coast of sub-Saharan Africa. Mauritania officially in 2007 criminalized the practice of slavery, yet it continues to go on in that country. In Niger, somewhere in the area of 8% of the population are believed to still be enslaved. In South Sudan, in the Republic of Congo, in various other African nations, there are still actual, very brutal types of slavery, often based on the conflict between different tribes and ethnicities in that part of the world. So there's still a lot of work to do. This practice is still with us, but the good news is how much ground has been made in that virtually no government of the world endorses it still. All say it is an evil, even if they don't effectively work to stamp it out. But what do we do about our biblical text? How do we approach this? How do we understand what's going on when we read ancient texts and we find, well, frankly, not a single biblical writer ever seems to clearly question the practice of owning other human beings, as I say, as labor-saving devices. So let's explore that a little bit. Slavery has been a part of human experience at least since the rise of the social stratification associated with the agricultural revolution. For years, human beings existed as relatively small hunter-gatherer groups of people who, for the most part, roamed around hunting and gathering. But when human beings began to settle into civilizations associated with the agricultural revolution, that is, settled agrarian or agricultural practices, there was a social stratification that began to develop whereby powerful people, and this was the basis of slavery, powerful people owned, acquired, vulnerable human beings and forced them to labor in their behalf. Sometimes this was the result of debt slavery. Someone would get head over heels in debt and they would have to pay it off, and then they were enslaved for that purposes. Other times there were wars where there were battles between different, what we would call nations, groups of people against others, and they enslaved those that were captured in war and made them work for them. There were a lot of different ways that slavery was practiced, but that practice goes at least back in our history to somewhere in the area about 10,000 years ago. It's a long time. And as I say, in some regions of the world, it's been almost continuously practiced to the present. But everywhere that the agricultural revolution reached, slavery was practiced. We sometimes, as Americans, almost act like we think the Europeans invented slavery when they brought, for the most part, Africans to this continent for the labor, but it had been going on long before that. And the Bible emerged from a culture where these practices were just accepted. It was just a part of their world. As a matter of fact, the writings from the Bible emerged from a world where the morality of slavery was an unquestioned assumption. And you'll search in vain in the Bible to find anyone, any writer, who says, wait a minute, it's wrong to own other human beings. It was just an idea that had not come. As a matter of fact, there are texts in the Hebrew Scriptures to the Old Testament which explicitly endorse slavery of different varieties. I want to give you a couple examples, so you want to take my word for it. I listed them there on the back of your bulletin. I want to read a couple of examples to you. First of all, from Deuteronomy. A lot of people have heard kind of like a Sunday school version of the Bible, and we don't always deal with these texts. I'm going to start with verse 10. This comes under a section known as the rules of warfare for the ancient Israelite people. Here's the instructions. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all of the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. If it does not submit to you peacefully, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it, and when Yahweh your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword, that is, kill them. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which Yahweh your God has given you. Well, that certainly does not conform to the Geneva Conventions. It was an ancient way of war. And for the Israelite people, slaves were acquired, legitimately it says, acquired, when they captured a city. Under those terms. That's tough, right? I mean, I think when we read those texts today, I hope very few people in the world would say that is ethically good or the way for human beings to behave toward one another. Yet it's found in Deuteronomy. It doesn't stop there. Let me give you another example. From Leviticus 25. I want to break in here. This is a long chapter, but verse 35. If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent upon you, you shall support them, and they shall live with you as though resident aliens. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God, let them live with you. You shall not lend them your money and an interest taken in advance or provide them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. So there is some, fellow Israelites were to be taken into consideration their kin and not try to make a profit on them if they fell into a financial state. But then it goes on, verse 39. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, this is debt slavery, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of the Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall be free from your authority. They shall go back to their family, return to their ancestral property. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves or sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God. Well, that's nice, right? Fellow Israelites, fellow Hebrews, you've been delivered, Yahweh delivered them from Egyptian slavery, at least their ancestors. So if they became so impoverished that they had to sell themselves into debt slavery to you, you're not to treat them as a slave. Don't deal with them harshly. And when the year of Jubilee, most they could serve was up to 7 years, and they would have to be released, and they could go back to their ancestral property. That's kind of humane, isn't it? Right? Well, we might not do it today, but you can see there where at least they're looking out for one another as fellow Israelites. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. I'll read on. As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing within you. Aliens are not from another planet. These are people who were not Israelites who were dwelling in Israel at the time. And it says, from their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, that they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. Implied is, you may rule over those who are not Israelites harshly. So, what does that mean? It means just as the world out of which the Bible emerged, the ancient Israelite people were in that world and they were part of it. And they had rules and, biblically based rules about slavery, which allowed them to at least practice a very harsh, sometimes a brutal form of slavery toward people as long as they were not of their own ethno-religious group. In other words, if they wanted to have slaves that they can force to work for them, even treating them harshly to make them work for them, and then bequeath to their children after them, they had to do it from those who are not a part of the Israelite tribal confederation. So you see, the Bible, when it comes to the issue of slavery, has some problems. It does. It certainly does. If you've been listening to me here, you've never heard me say otherwise. But this is tricky. I grew up in a tradition where we said every word of the Bible reveals the mind of God. In other words, God's attitude about any subject that you can find a text to talk about. Which raises the question, if you believe that, then you have to virtually take the position that God is pro-slavery, at least for people who are outside your ethno-religious group. And I guarantee you, I know this to be true. I can cite you textual references to it. Some of my ancestors in the South, Baptist preachers in the South, owned slavery, owned slaves, kept slaves, felt justified in treating them harshly in order to keep them, and then used texts like these, as well as New Testament texts, to justify it. Felt it deeply, felt it so strongly that they were willing to fight a war, the bloodiest war in American history, to help preserve that kind of society. Not all slavery throughout human history is race-based. But in the South, the southern part of the United States, slavery was very race-based. Globally, it's often been based on race sometimes on ethnicity, tribal differences, sometimes simply because people had power, other people didn't, and they were vulnerable to being misused in this way. So what do we do about it? What do we do about the text where both Old and New Testament never seems to question something that many of us today see as the most fundamental question? It was Abraham Lincoln who said, if slavery be not wrong, then what is wrong? So you've heard me deal with this before, but let me give you a little insight on how I approach it. It's certainly true that what happened, what really broke the power of slavery was, for the most part, it was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement over the late 17th, in the 18th century that began in Europe, where people began to question a lot of things. One of the things that began to question was the legitimacy of people owning other people. Christianity was influenced by the Enlightenment. I'll say, and I said in the last point of this sermon, that the Enlightenment had more to do with Christianity's transformation on this subject than Christianity by itself, because Christianity was still trying to, give deference to these texts that we've read. But as people begin to question this notion, and ideas such as we find in the Declaration of Independence, which we inconsistently applied for a long time, all men are created equal. Those ideas took time, but they did begin to emerge in England and in Europe and eventually in the Americas, to the extent that, again, we fought a great war over it and ended slavery in this country. And to our credit, Western civilization has been on the cutting edge since those times of trying to see slavery abolished around the world, and have been very effective in doing so. So I'm thankful for that. But what do we do about our Bible? How do we read it? Well, you've heard me say that Jesus summarized that the greatest text, the greatest commandment in the Scriptures are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Amen. Now, you'll notice something in the way Jesus told this parable. He does give some hope here, even though he doesn't explain it or break it out. Jesus believed the kingdom of God was about to appear. And the way he told this parable is interesting, for you remember what it says. It says the images of these slaves who are supposed to be dressed and ready for action and have their lights shining, so that the master might return from a wedding banquet, late at night presumably. And those slaves would be ready to greet him when he came home, and they would have the lights on and the doors open for him. And the master would be so pleased when he got there with those slaves. What does it say he does for the slaves? He has them sit down and he serves them. He girds himself and serves them. A reversal. So in the parable, there is some light there. There's some hope there from Jesus, where Jesus anticipated the world where the kingdom of God would come and there would be a great reversal, where master would then serve slave. Unfortunately, it's not broken out that way fully for us. But there's a hope there. There's a notion. And I read the text of the Bible in this way. And this is how I read the Bible. I believe the Bible through the lens of the message that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, which means treating others as you wish to be treated. And as Abraham Lincoln said, again, who in the United States is credited more than any other individual with helping end slavery, says, as I would not be a slave, neither will I be a master. As I would not be a slave, neither would I be a master. What's Lincoln doing there? What principle is he applying that we all know? Oh, what's that? Equality, sure. The golden rule, exactly. Treating others as you wish to be treated. What undermines slavery, at least from the standpoint of those who were either Jewish or Christian, Islam was slower to come along on this. But what undermined slavery in the minds of many Jews and Christians were not the biblical texts they read, but the application of the principle of loving your neighbor as yourself and treating others as you wish to be treated. Whereas Lincoln says, as I would not be a slave, neither will I be a master. You're using the golden rule and you're practicing empathy. You're putting yourself in the position of someone who's been forced into labor in behalf of others against their will. And you're saying, I would never want to be in that situation. And if I would never want to be in that situation, I don't want anyone else to be. And that is the principle there. And that's, by the way, how we have to read our Bibles today. We have to look for the principle there, the great principle, and then we have to reinterpret the text in light of those principles. For if we don't, we'll be stuck where the fundamentalists are. That is, every time we read a text, we say, I give up. Even though that doesn't seem right to me, I guess it's okay because there's a text. No, we take the broad principles and read the text and the stories of our Bible through those principles. And if we don't, we'll continue to fall into the errors of the past. Because there will always be somebody out there who will use the Bible to justify the mistreatment of others. And unfortunately, there's enough material in it to do that if we're not careful. So here's my principle that I take around with me everywhere I go. And it's this: I do not want to do to someone else what I would not want them to do to me. That's the principle. And by the way, if we would embrace that principle, and if we'd have thought through its implications sooner, we would have avoided a lot of great injustices that have been committed through the years against other people. Still to this day. So here's what I'm saying. When we think about masters and slaves and we read these principles and these texts that seem to say it's just the way the world is, don't be afraid to question the way the world is. Amen. One day we'll all look back. Let's hope this doesn't happen to people in this room. We've all been warned. I've been warned. Let's hope that we don't someday look back and say, you know, if I'd have just lived out the principle I knew was right, I could have avoided doing this horrible thing that I did to others. I always ask myself this question: what will, 100 years from now, I look back on my life and think, you know, I did that blindly and stupidly and didn't think through how my actions were hurting other people. Live the golden rule. It's not the only ethical principle, but it's a very good place to start. And it helped deliver us from a whole multitude of other sins.